Good evening and welcome to this Wednesday night book study. If you've been here before or if you're watching this for the first time, we have two outreach events every week. On Tuesdays, we talk about intentional communities or neo-monasticism, which probably apply better to us, but it's a way for us to help other founders, or we can also ask for help from them. But on Wednesdays, it's a book study, and the book we're studying is Christian Anarchism by Alexander Christianopoulos, who wrote a doctoral thesis on this subject, where he tried to collect all the writings on the subject in one place. And very central in Christian anarchism is the Sermon on the Mount, and within the Sermon on the Mount is the doctrine of resist not evil, which is, for Tolstoy, is one of the most important things about this sermon. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus makes about 6 or 8 main points, and one of them is that not to resist evil. And within that section, we have 5 points. He's making 5 points, and we are up to number 4 today. And it's called the cycle of violence, and it begins on page 37. And if you have the book, I have the abridged edition here, and it may be a different page number on your edition, or if you have downloaded it from the internet. But before we actually get into that, I want to make sure that we totally understand that Jesus did not really change anything. The purpose was always to exact justice, and it's going to continue to be about justice. So, and that's what he means by he did not come to abandon the law, but he came to fulfill it. So he's just giving us some additional information about what we have to do to exact justice in our society. And last time we talked about the lex talionis, which is the law of retaliation. The Old Testament idea that for justice means one eye for one eye and a life for a life. So today we're going to talk a little bit about this cycle of violence that comes from that. We have not talked much about the word evil, but Christian anarchists tend to be generalists. We don't really get into details about personal vendettas, but in a larger context. So it's not about the evil one, but it's evil in general. And that may be a bit of a stretch. So, because Jesus in his sermon only talks about when you get slapped on the right cheek, you turn also the left. Or if somebody takes your coat, you give them the tunic as well, and so on and so forth. So that is very, very specific. But anarchists tend to believe that what he really means by that is in general, so that it also covers things like evil in the sense of social, political, and economic evil. So it's more like what we now use in general as a systemic oppression or evil, as he says. So yeah, that's maybe a little bit of a stretch, but just applying it to an eye for an eye, or to turning the other cheek is probably not. I think that's too narrow. So perhaps between the two extremes, there is what we're talking about. But then again, for anarchists, it's very, very broad. So Jesus has this way of dealing with this new way of looking at justice. And the chapter talks about lex talionis as violence is almost universally accepted as the justified method for humanity to confront injustice. So there is really no other way to do that, they say. But Jesus is going to show us a different way. But like Tolstoy says, that he says that it's the whole history of humankind for him betrays incessant and yet ultimately failed attempts to resist evil with evil, to deal violently with problems of violence, to wage wars in order to preclude other wars. I think if you were with us back when we went through the Plan B book study, we talked about now I forgot, I think Augustine, but I'm not sure, came up with 8 ways to justify war. So this kind of contradicts that a little bit, because anarchists say that there is no way ever that there is a justification for violence. In fact, they say that violence multiplies violence. Because one reason for that is because what one person sees as fair, the other party may see it as an aggression. So, and then that kind of requires retaliation, and you have a vicious cycle going right there. What also happens sometimes is that people will have a cause, and they say that violence is the only way to do it, and they will come up with all kinds of excuses why violence is justified. Because nobody ever comes up with an evil goal. Their goal is always honorable and good, but the only way to do it is by use of force. And anarchists reject that idea completely. We're meeting here a new writer. His name is Ellul, not Ellul, because he's French, and that's why it's pronounced Ellul. He is one of the main writers in this subject, and he writes about this idea that there is a way to justify, that the means justify the goal, or the goal justifies the means that you're using violence. But it always ends up that you completely focus on the violence, not on the goal you were trying to achieve at all. So, yeah. So he says, I think he's the one who says, revolutionary violence promises counter-revolutionary violence. So whatever you do, you'll always end up with more violence. One of the fundamental problems with violent methods, Christian anarchist idea is that once we consent to use violence ourselves, we have to consent to adversaries' use of it too. So in other words, if you buy into this idea that you can achieve an honorable goal with violence, you automatically invite your opponent to use violence as well, and that is not desirable. So yeah, you really give up your right to tell the other party that they cannot use violence when you do that. Yeah, the use of violence creates justification for further violence. That's what it says. So yeah. Yeah. So Elul kind of made some laws about violence, and here's one of them. He says, his first law declares that violence becomes a habit of simplification of situations. So by that he means that a lot of people buy into this idea that violence is an easy way out of injustice. And it is. But violence is always apparently the shortest and surest way, but he immediately adds, and in the long run, that appearance always deceives. So when you buy into that, you are deceiving yourself. Yeah, and Tolstoy says, as fire will not put out fire, evil will not destroy evil. Even if you think we are right, we must resist the temptation to force others to obey our will. Yeah. So that is pretty much it for tonight, because next week we are now going into the last point of this section about resisting evil, and this is where Jesus is going to show us how to overcome this cycle of violence. I hope you enjoyed this little chapter here, and so look forward to seeing you next week.